But Kristy, thank you so much for joining us. EVV is a huge topic still today. I still think there's a lot of confusion around it. Because it's all state specific EMRs, some are, some aren't embedded, or whatever the case may be. It seems pretty confusing to me. So we're going to dive into this. And I know a lot of this stuff can be state by state specific information. We're going to keep it kind of an overview. Probably not going to dive into each state. There's 50 of them, right? So, Kristy, tell us a little bit about EVV. How's this thing get started? Tell us a little bit about what you do and what are some of the challenges that you're seeing.
So EVV, as Hannah said, it's electronic visit verification, and it is something that the CMS has mandated through the 21st Century Cures Act. So EVV is in every state, like you said, and territories, if they provide Medicaid EVV services. So it's basically captures, I hate to call it a time clock, but that's pretty much exactly what it is. It's capturing who's providing the service to whom, the date, the service, the time in and time out. So it's just essentially telling the state payers and the payers who's there, why, when, and it's they can go and do audit-based compliance from that. And funny story, a lot of people don't know is CMS actually asked states to voluntarily implement EVV way back when, and when that really wasn't happening, that's when the 21st Century Cures Act was signed into law in 2016, and here we are.
Now, do some states have accountability, or do they have different accountability? How's that all work?
They do have accountability. There's outcomes-based certification that states can go through so that they can get their EVV program certified and received enhanced funding back from CMS. And for those states who do that, there is reporting metrics that they have to do with CMS. And that's, one of them includes manual entries and edits. So for those visits that aren't captured using a digital device, I don't want to say it's GPS, but it could be home or community. But if it's manually entered or edited, the state has to report that to CMS. And then that filters down to the providers as we see some of the compliance efforts to get those manual entries and edits down. They also have to report how many EVV visits were paid versus how many were collected. And that is relevant in those states who don't deny right now because of EVV. So if 1,000 EVV visits were collected, but 2,000 were paid, then CMS is going to ask the state what they're doing about that to get providers compliant. So there is some accountability with the states to CMS, but that always trickles back down to the providers.
So talk about why this was implemented.
For fraud, waste, and abuse, there are billions of dollars lost each year to fraud, waste, and abuse. And that's not just in home care, that's every healthcare across the board, doctors, dentists, DME, all the things Medicaid and Medicare related. Though fortunately, this is just in Medicaid and it still applies. Billions of dollars are lost. And, the numbers can vary anywhere from between 10% and 30% of Medicaid dollars spent. My personal philosophy is $1 lost to fraud, waste, or abuse is a life negatively impacted. So I see the life behind the dollar, not just the dollar spent.
Yeah. And then how did the states choose their models for EVV?
Well, so when the Cures Act came out in 2016, I had just started with the state agency and was told to implement this thing I'd never heard of before in my life. And so states really didn't have a whole lot of guidance except for what was in the Cures Act, and that wasn't a lot. CMS hadn't come out with their FAQs yet to help guide states in their implementation. So states basically looked at their stakeholders, which were providers and recipients, and some of them, a lot of them actually, did polls and said, how are we going to implement EVV? What's your practices? Things like that, because they understood that this is impacting significantly providers' business operations. And in Ohio, it came back that the open model would be the best choice. In some states, they may say provider choice. And so I'll go back a minute. Open model means that providers can use their own vendor or they can use the state's vendor. Ohio did it a little bit different. They're kind of like an open hybrid, which means that the MCOs must use the state system. There are other states like Pennsylvania who allow MCOs to pick their own vendor. So, but then for provider choice, that means that you don't get the option of using the state's vendor. You have to pay for your own. And then there's also the closed model, which means you don't get to pick your own. You have to use ours. So states vary it based on their stakeholder groups. And there are some states who started out as a closed model, got a few lawsuits, and are now opening back up. But I think across the board, open seems to be the most accepted and the most used.
Yeah. Do you see states that maybe did a closed model or a hybrid model going to more of the open model?
There's a couple in the process right now, Connecticut being one of them. They started out as closed and now for their personal care services. And with this home health service implementation deadline that CMS had of 2023, but was extended to 24, they're now home health open, personal care closed, but they're trying to roll their personal care more into the open side now.
Now, cost-wise, does that fall on the individual agency, or are these being subsidized?
There are some states that allow subsidizing. I can't recall the state, but there was a grant that providers could apply for. And there's also reimbursement rates we know aren't high enough for home health care providers anyway, but they did increase the administrative rate a little bit in that reimbursement. But what I've seen working with providers and vendors across the country is that that's still not enough. Providers are spending a lot of money trying to get compliant with EVV. So there have been some, like I said, grants or incentives that providers can do. Some states like Arizona a couple of years ago came out and said, if your EVV compliance is at this point, we'll give you this amount of money. So providers were able to apply for that and get some extra money for being compliant. But it's still, if you look at it as a whole, it falls on the provider's shoulders.
What are some other challenges that providers are facing across the U.S. when it comes to EVV, in addition to the cost?
So there's that is a sore
loaded question.
A loaded question. So there's a lot of things, whenever states go out to bid for these EVV vendors, there's an expiration date on that contract. So then the providers, now that they may be compliant, they've got their own vendor, they're plugged into the state solution, and then the state's going to change. So, we've had a couple states this last year that their EVV vendor that was currently in place didn't win the next bid when that contract expired. Florida is one of them. For the fee-for-service for ACA, it was a NetSmart contract, but then, during the bid process, HHA won the second bid. So providers billing ACA in Florida are going to have to transition to HHA if that truly comes to fruition. We haven't seen, on my part, I haven't seen HHA get started yet, but that's supposed to be happening this year.
Now, those
so
like
it's
long-term contracts, or are they like 12-month contracts? So, could they be switching every year?
Well,
kind of like health insurance?
Kinda. So they'll put it out. So every state may have a different term length on their contract. Some are 6, some are 5, some are 10. But normally with state contracting, every year or every 2 years, the contract is technically up, but then you have extension periods. And we saw a state I won't mention because I know that's probably still a very sore subject for them, but there was a state who started down the path with a vendor and ended up firing the vendor and having to go back out to bid before they ever got live. So sometimes it can be a very short-term contract if the vendor doesn't perform.
Well, that's some of the challenge, right? Is that, depending on the volume, you think about a vendor taking on a whole state's volume, right? Especially on a closed, that could be a lot of pressure on a vendor like that, an EVV vendor.
Yeah, and especially with the deadlines. If you look at the CMS deadlines of personal care and home health being at the same time, separate but the same time respectively, all these vendors are trying to change and go live at the same time, and it's just causing failures.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Or they maybe start out pretty good, but then they get slammed with volume, and that's got to be a challenge too. So
it is. Yeah. And the update to the technical specifications that these vendors have to keep up with. There's a vendor out there that I will not name, but they are just known for changing their specs for some reason, and vendors start getting these rejections, and providers are upset because they may be losing revenue, and the vendors had no way of knowing because they just weren't told. So
yeah. How many EVV vendors are there out there?
For state aggregators, there's quite a few, but as far as EMRs who have EVV systems, I had too many to count.
Yeah. So an agency's got to, make sure they got the right EMR, right? That would integrate with that EVV, correct?
Yes.
Which could be another stumbling block.
It can be. Actually in Louisiana right now, it's a struggle because with the way the state is implementing it, they're doing something I've never seen before, which is requiring basically the IP address of the phone collecting the GPS coordinates. And that's something that I've not seen before. And so vendors are struggling with that because they don't own the devices that the caregivers are using. So it's some of the vendors that states are using, it's a struggle, but the state, due to compliance and program integrity reasons, that's how they chose to implement. But when this is the only state doing it that vendors may be in, they struggle to get that configured. So it can take some time.
So what if a provider doesn't want to use the state's EVV vendor? Are there other options if they're closed?
So if it's a closed state, no, there's no other
Okay.
choice. Yeah. But if it's an open or a hybrid or an MCO model, as long as the state is allowing the provider to bring their own vendor, then I highly recommend that providers who want to use their own vendor do their due diligence and make sure that the vendor is currently connected either in that state or other states that are similar so that they can make sure that the vendor can do it. And, we have state systems like SanData and HHA, CareBridge, Authenticare, they're in a lot of states. So most of your larger vendor has experience connecting with them, and you're probably not going to have much of an issue. But if your vendor isn't experienced in implementation, that's not going to go well. And also, if they don't have solid reporting and there's a lot of questions that providers should ask as they're entertaining a vendor.
Yeah. Now, do you help them pick the right one? Do you help them go through that process, or tell us a little bit more about like how agencies can go about making the right decision?
So if agencies ask me, I absolutely will help them. I'll give them, I was a contract manager for the state, so I can be pretty hard when it comes to vendor management. So I will absolutely give pointers on this is what you should look for. And especially when it comes to operations, it's not just whether or not they can connect with SanData, their HHAs of the world. How are they supporting you operationally? So it's a multifaceted approach that you have to take to it. So if providers ask me to help, I will 100% help them. If they have a vendor and they just need to know how to do these, technical sessions to figure out what's going on with their EVV visits, which is way more common than you think, then I help them with that too. I'm not just on the operations side. I actually do look at the technical specifications and look at files being transferred back and forth, because the unfortunate reality is the states are contracted with the providers. They're not contracted with the providers' vendors. So states expect the providers to keep their vendors compliant, but providers aren't by and large technical. So it's very difficult to have those technical conversations with the vendor when something's failing to send to the state.
Yeah. Do you help, or do you have like questions that you provide? Let's say, okay, if you're in the state of, let's say, Texas, home of the Cowboys, you know what I'm saying? Do you provide them a list saying, okay, in the state of Texas, here's the questions you should ask?
So I don't necessarily, so like we mentioned, I'm more of a holistic approach. I know that there are consultants out there who have a list of things like this, a checkbox. But as we know, Medicaid isn't that you can't fit Medicaid in a box. The only consistent thing across the country with Medicaid is that there's no consistencies. So what I do is I talk to the provider or the vendors I work with and say, okay, what is your business model? Do you provide these services? Let me learn more about you. And then based on their operations and needs, I'll give them, like, this is what I would ask.
Yeah.
And if
So
they
you
invite
you
me
help.
into the conversation, I'll come into the conversation with their vendor.
Well, I think that's excellent.
Yeah.
Now that's service. I love service. You know what I mean? Because it's one thing to tell people what they can do. It's another thing to walk them through it, right? So
Yeah.
I always love technology, and I love the fact that we can screen share like we're doing today. And I always tell my team too, hey, don't just tell them, screen share, show them exactly
Show it.
step by step, because you get into that stuff, you get into anything. I mean, this is an awesome field. First of all, I love this field, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're helping people help people. But there's a lot out there, right? And it seems like everyone's trying to get some piece of the pie. And I've learned really fast that you got to help them make the right decision, because they really don't have a lot of time to make a bad one.
That's right.
Right. And because, I'm assuming you look at everything too, from operational to clinical to financial. And those
compliance.
are the three. Yeah. And compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Compliance. Oh my gosh. I don't know. I know that's a hard thing right there, right?
Well, I mean, let's talk about compliance a little bit, because as with anything, regulations are only as good as they can be enforced. So, Kristy, how are states enforcing these EVV requirements?
So compliance is a big topic, and one of the I have a compliance legal consultant that does this compliance monitoring for me. So that way I also do it, but she's a legal eagle, she's an attorney, so she knows where to look where I don't. So one of the things to do is to make sure you know what the state's going to do before the state does it. For example, in Ohio, they're preparing to start denying claims. And they've got a new rule coming out 7/1 that essentially says the state reserves the right to give you 90 days notice, and then we will start denying your claims due to EVV. So it's the process of now preparing those providers and vendors. We have states like Arizona who started denying claims, I believe it was 2021 or somewhere through there. So their compliance effort is denying your claims, as well as Colorado. In Indiana, they did basically a post-pay, they suspended the claim for a little bit here beginning of the April and said, okay, your claim is suspended to let you know it's going to be a denial. You have 7 days to fix it, and then we're going to go into denials. But before that, they would put EVV error codes on claims to let providers know there's going to be an issue with your EVV claim. You need to figure out what it is. You know, there are states that aren't denying today, but they may say, okay, well, if you're not in compliance per this percentage, we're going to start taking some of that money back. And then there are the post-pay reviews. And that's essentially where program integrity, you know, does a historical look at, or the Department of Medicaid, whatever division they choose to have. But they'll look at your claims compared to your EVV visits and see if there's any money that they need to take back because your EVV is not compliant. So there's several different ways that states can do force compliance. And one of the one I'm seeing right now that's a bit concerning to me is the manual entry and edit compliance enforcement. And I know that's something coming from CMS, so that's not necessarily on the states. But there are some states that are getting up to that 70, 80% mark for providers that, you know, you're not supposed to have anything more than manually enter or edit. You know, if you've given somebody 20% of their visits a month, and they may be a very large agency, if they work out in rural communities, let's say Pennsylvania, you know, Ohio, we have Amish country, Nebraska has a lot of farming country, there may not be service out there. So they have to enter those visits manually. You know, or you could have a recipient who says, no technology in my home because it triggers them. So there are going to be people who aren't exempt under the CMS rule to say that, okay, well, these has to be manually entered. So it's a little concerning from a provider operations perspective as these percentages creep up, that providers are going to have money taken back because they can't meet the requirement.
How long does it take to manually input that stuff?
Depending on the system, it can actually be pretty quick. I have a provider in North Carolina who has a couple recipients who get triggered by technology. So I did a training session and walked them through, and we were able to enter the visit pretty quickly. So anywhere between 30 seconds and a minute if you get really good at it. It doesn't take long. But if you have thousands of visits, it's going to take a very long time.
Well, for sure. Well,
Yeah.
and you also know that, you know, the biggest punishment, and you know this is where it's going to go, right? The states that aren't denying claims today are going to start denying claims. So if you're a provider today living in a state that isn't denying, how should they go about preparing? Because we know it's coming.
So, you know, Indiana is getting geared up to deny home health claims starting in July. So providers should be looking at the remittance advices. And, you know, I don't want to get too technical on the call, but remittance advices can be 835s, which are data transmissions that you can look at. It's a very technical file, and I would not do that for claims compliance because a lot of vendors who look at that only give you error codes on the denied claims. These errors are posting unpaid. So I recommend providers pull the actual remittance advice, the PDF version, and look for those error codes. And if the error code says that there's an EVV issue, then go into your EVV system, the state system, look and see, you know, does it say that it's incomplete or unmatched, or look in your vendor system and make sure that the visit's sent. Find out why you would have had that error and then fix it. Because I can tell you now, for the providers using a third-party vendor, please understand that these vendors are in a lot of different states. So when it comes to asking them to make changes, you may be 3 or 4 months down the road getting a change made. So it's important the minute, I say don't wait until the state says they're going to deny. Go ahead and get compliant because we never really know. I mean, there are some states who can give you a 30-day notice and say, done, you're done. And your vendor's never going to make it. So start today. Look at your EVV remittance advices, find out why there's an issue, and then fix it. Work with your vendor if you can't figure it out. Vendor may have to work with the state's vendor. You know, we've got a lot of touch points there, but start today and figure it out. You know, unfortunately, there are states like California that, to my knowledge, they're not putting the EVV error codes on the remittance advices. So you just got to try to compare. Sometimes it's line by line and it can take some time, but that time is going to be a lot cheaper than having all your claims denied.
Look at you, Kristy, bringing back up California.
Yeah.
Oh,
so,
goodness.
I mean, preparation is definitely key. I know that's really what you're stressing here. What would you say to agencies, providers who just don't feel like they're ready? They're not ready for claims issues or compliance reinforcement. Where do they even start if they're not already getting that remittance advice?
If they're not getting it, then I say if you have someone who does compliance within your agency, have a conversation. There are some provider agencies who are very large. They're across multiple states. That's a challenge in
Mhm.
itself, but they have compliance people that can come into meetings and say, okay, this is how we do it. This is how we get compliant and how we're not going to have revenue impact because of EVV. If you don't have that, then start reaching out to the state saying, hey, we're seeing that we don't feel like we're compliant. Help us. Some states are very good at that. Colorado is amazing when they work with their providers. I don't like it when I have an issue in Colorado, but I really like it because if I need to reach out to the state, they're a partner. So there are states, and Indiana's the same way. So if you have a state where they're really working with you as a provider, reach out to them because if they can help you, they will. They'll give you some pointers. And if all else fails, reach out to someone like me. I'm not the only one out there. Find a consultant who can come in and help you get your business compliant. If your vendor can't do it, if the state's not willing to do it, and you don't have the expertise, reach out because at the end of the day, that revenue loss, that's going to cause an access to care issue. We already have a caregiver retention problem across the country. And if you start not being able to pay them, then you're not going to be able to provide care. So the investment up front is going to secure people's future.
Yeah, I was going to ask you with agencies that have locations in multiple states, and maybe one state's an open state, but the state next to them's a closed state. Was that a little bit more challenging for them?
It's very challenging, especially for those states who may have services on the border. So you may have a nurse that's a reciprocity agreement with the next state they can work. So you may have a nurse working in one state that's open and she's using your system, but then she goes to the next state to do the services and it's closed. So now she has to have 2 applications on her mobile device so that she knows when to call in and when not to. There's also login issues. There's, I'll name the vendor, but there's a vendor who won't allow you to have more than one email address. So I have a provider who's in 10 states, it's challenging because you have to make up email addresses so that you can work across state lines for that vendor.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of challenges when it comes to crossing state lines.
So with your unique experience and your perspectives on the EVV side and insights that you've even provided us today, would you be willing to share with us, like, what's the future of EVV? What's this look like?
So I've heard rumor that, CMS could possibly look toward piloting this in Medicare, and I think that would be an absolute disaster if they do that.
Mhm.
So I'm hoping that doesn't go that direction. I can see this very easily bleeding over into transportation because there is a lot of fraud in transportation. So I can see that kind of going that direction. I could also see, I saw, I think it was in New York a few years ago, there was an RFP to use EVV in a prison type setting for work release. So I don't know that it would be EVV as you know it today, but the technology itself, it can be applied quite a few areas.
Yeah,
So
those
we
are good
just
points.
passed a bill where cows are going to wear monitors now. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't see a lot of cows just randomly walking down the street. You know what I mean? Like I even lived on a farm. We didn't lose a lot of cows. Now, there may be 1 or 2 times that a cow gets out, but they just kind of stand right there and they eat the other grass on the other side of the fence. It's not like they go very far. You know what I mean? And so
No, they're going to go from the food for me.
yeah. So we're not going to have to put EVVs on our cows, are we?
I certainly hope not. But
Stray cats, maybe.
maybe that may
Yeah.
be very successful in making sure you know where your feline is.
Yeah. Well, I put one of those, was those apple finders?
Oh
What are
yeah,
those
those
things
air
called?
tags.
Yeah, I put that on the cat one time because I was just like curious, where's this cat go at night? You know what I mean? Because he always goes somewhere and then he comes back in the morning, he's ready to eat. And I was like, where's this cat going? So I put one of those things on. The cat was all over the neighborhood. Just
They got to
hopping
make their
fences like
rounds.
it's nothing. I'm telling you, it's an alley cat.
Tomcat. Hope it was fixed.
They leave Tom out of it.
Well, hey, Kristy, sorry, we are so sidetracked, aren't we? Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And I want to give our listeners some information on how to find you. So can you share with us where they can learn about In Your Corner Consulting or how to contact you to get more information?
Absolutely. So it's if you can see the screen, my web address is iyc-consulting.com. And you can reach me at Kristy@iycconsulting.com. So feel free to reach out, visit the email. And if you Google me, I'm usually one of the first ones that pop up in your corner consulting. So reach out and I will talk. I've had so many conversations with providers. Just because we have a conversation on the phone doesn't mean we're going to be a partner. It just means I'm giving you some strategic direction and you go about your way. So feel free to reach out. I have no problem having a conversation with people. I mean, it's like I said at the beginning, Every dollar lost to fraud, waste, or abuse is a life impacted. Same thing with compliance. If a provider is going to go out of business because of EVV, I want to do what I can to make sure those people keep receiving services. So reach out.
Amen.
Absolutely.
Well, we've heard nothing but great things about you, and I know
Thanks.
you're very, very busy. So it's an honor that you could take some time out and share this information. Because again, this is really, it's complex. It's just another piece. It's another piece that there are professionals like yourself that can guide agencies in the right direction. And I loved how you put it. Hey, just because we have a conversation doesn't mean, you have to use me or whatever. I'm here to help the industry. I'm here to help you guys. And if that's me, great. If it's not, then, best of luck. I support you in every way I can. So we really appreciate that very much.
Well, I thank you so much
Yeah.
for inviting me on. This has been a great experience.
And to our
We agree.
listeners, we will see you next time.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.